Welcome back to the deep dive. We sift through the noise, look at the core source material, and really try to give you the knowledge you need on these complex global stories.
Bah.
And today, wow, we're looking north, just across the border, at a situation in Canada that it feels pretty intense, less like typical friction, more like a real storm brewing for the government there.
It really is. We're diving into the serious political trouble facing Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his team. What our sources show is this sort of brutal collision of three big things happening at once.
Okay.
You've got his government's deep domestic weakness, politically speaking. Then there's the, frankly, long-standing personal animosity between Trudeau and former President Donald Trump.
That history.
Exactly. And layering on top of all that are these immediate, potentially devastating economic threats coming from the U.S., especially tied to a potential Trump return.
Okay, let's really unpack this. So our mission here for you, listening, is to get past the headlines. We want to analyze how these trade issues, which have a long history, are now tangled up with personal political feuds, and how that's creating a crisis that could genuinely reshape the economic ties between two massive trading partners, it feels like. Well, diplomacy through humiliation, almost.
That's a harsh way to put it, but yeah, the sources point that way. And the timing, the immediate context here is just so dramatic. It shows how fragile things are in Ottawa right now.
You mean the Freeland resignation?
Exactly. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, who's arguably the most significant figure in that government besides Trudeau himself, she announced her resignation just days ago. That sent shockwaves.
A huge deal.
Massive. And here's the detail that really tells the story. Almost immediately after that news broke, Donald Trump publicly jumps in to mock her departure.
Wow.
It just makes it crystal clear how interconnected this whole crisis is with his, let's say, geopolitical focus and personal history.
Okay, that definitely sets the stage. So to really get what's happening now and the stakes involved if Trump does return for a second term, we can't just look at today.
No, you have to rewind.
We need to go back and understand the roots of this hostility. It's a real mix, isn't it? Policy fights, old grudges, and yeah, that one very, very public incident. Let's start there with the personal stuff that really burst into the open, the two-faced incident back at the 2019 NATO summit in Britain. That moment just went viral, didn't it?
It really did. It became this perfect symbol. So the summit was early December 2019, but the key event happened the night before, December 3rd, at a reception, I think it was at Buckingham Palace.
Right.
And a video leaks out. It spreads like wildfire. It shows Trudeau standing with Boris Johnson, Macron, Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, and even a member of the royal family.
And what exactly were they doing? It looked like gossiping.
It looked very much like that. They seemed to be having a lighthearted chat, but the subject was clearly President Trump. Trudeau, in particular, was caught on camera appearing to sort of mock Trump's tendency to hold these very long, rambling press conferences.
Okay, so making fun of his style.
Yeah, and you could hear the laughter around him. The problem was, this wasn't some private joke. This was the Canadian Prime Minister, seemingly joining in with key European leaders to ridicule the President of the United States.
Not a good look, diplomatical.
Not at all. The damage was instant, and it fed right into Trump's existing narratives about allies maybe not respecting the U.S. enough.
So how did Trump handle it? I remember he was asked about it the very next day, wasn't he, during a press event with Angela Merkel?
He was, and his response was vintage Trump. It was immediate, simple, and pretty cutting. He didn't get into a policy debate. He didn't defend his press conferences. He went straight for the personal attack. He just called Trudeau two-faced, just like that. It wasn't just a diplomatic jab. It set this really personal tone of mistrust, of animosity that's basically defined their relationship ever since. It showed Trump really separates policy from personal respect, and in his eyes, Trudeau had massively failed that respect test.
Okay, but it's important, as you said, not to think this is just about personal insults, right? Because there were already serious policy disagreements brewing before that incident.
Absolutely. That incident was like fuel on an existing fire.
So let's talk about defense spending. That was something Trump hit Canada on early and often.
That's right. What's interesting is, long before that NATO video leak, Trump was already publicly criticizing Canada for, in his view, not contributing its fair share to NATO.
This is the 2% GDP target.
Exactly. NATO members agree, in principle anyway, to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. Canada. Well, Canada has historically fallen well short of that, often around 1.3%, maybe 1.4% of GDP.
So Trump had a factual point there, a policy basis for his criticism, even if the delivery was, let's say, aggressive.
He did. It gave him a legitimate political talking point. Canada was benefiting from the collective security umbrella, heavily underwritten by the U.S., without meeting the agreed-upon spending commitment.
Right.
So in his framing, Canada was kind of delinquent, relying on American taxpayers. He used this repeatedly to criticize Trudeau publicly. It sort of laid the groundwork for treating Canada less like an equal partner and more like maybe a freeloader that needed to be brought into line.
Okay, and that mindset, that framing, leads us directly to the really big one, the core economic friction that underlies so much of the current crisis, NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes. And for anyone listening, it's hard to overstate how fundamental NAFTA was. It kicked off back in 1994. It created, at the time, the largest free trade zone in the world. It totally integrated the North American economies, U.S., Canada, Mexico.
It was the bedrock for decades.
Absolutely. The bedrock of commerce, supply chains, everything.
But Trump, from the very start of his 2016 campaign, he saw it completely differently.
Completely. He was relentless. He consistently called NAFTA the worst trade agreement ever signed, maybe the worst deal in history sometimes.
Yeah.
His core argument was always that NAFTA encouraged U.S. companies to move manufacturing jobs, especially to Mexico, and that it was fundamentally unfair to American workers.
So that core belief that Canada and Mexico, too, were sort of exploiting the U.S. through this trade deal. That's really the philosophical engine driving the tariff threats we're seeing now.
That's exactly it. It's a structural belief system for him. Even if the way he applies it feels very personal when it comes to someone like Trudeau. Right, so that fundamental belief that the U.S. was getting a raw deal, especially with Canada, that led directly to the first big trade attack during the Trump presidency. And it's crucial because it set the precedent for what Canada is fearing right now. This is the 2018 tariff shock.
Okay, remind us of the specifics of that first round. What was the strategy there?
Well, in March 2018, the Trump administration rolled out these global tariffs. It was 25% on imported steel and 10% on imported aluminum.
And the justification was national security.
Yeah, they used Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows for tariffs if imports are deemed a threat to national security, which raised a lot of eyebrows when applied to close allies like Canada.
Right. But initially, Canada and Mexico were exempt, weren't they, for a little while?
They were, yeah. For about 2 months, they got a temporary pass.
So what changed?
Well, the NAFTA renegotiations were getting really tense, basically stalling out. So in May 2018, the administration revoked those exemptions for Canada and Mexico.
Ah, okay. So the tariffs became leverage in the NAFTA talks.
Exactly. The message was pretty blunt. Negotiate on our terms or face the economic consequences. Maximum pressure.
And how badly did this hit Canada? What was the immediate reaction up there?
It was a huge shock, a massive blow. You have to remember, Canada is the #1 supplier of both steel and aluminum to the United States.
Right.
So entire industries, supply chains built over decades on the assumption of free trade suddenly faced this massive tax. Sources in Ottawa at the time used words like betrayal.
Because they're a close security partner.
Yeah, a key ally in NORAD, NATO, suddenly being treated like China or Russia under this national security banner. It felt punitive and arbitrary.
And Canada didn't just take it, did they? They hit back, along with Mexico.
Oh, absolutely not. They retaliated almost immediately. Canada slapped dollar-for-dollar counter tariffs on about, I think it was $16.6 billion worth of U.S. goods.
And they were targeted, weren't they? Not just random goods.
Very targeted. They went after symbolic products, things that would cause political pain in specific U.S. regions or states. Think Kentucky bourbon.
Right, Mitch McConnell's state.
Exactly. Harley-Davidson motorcycles coming out of Wisconsin, Paul Ryan's territory then, plus agricultural stuff like yogurt, certain food products. The goal was clear. And specific constituencies in the U.S. feel the pain and pressure their representatives to push back against the Trump tariffs.
So a sharp trade war, basically.
For a time, yes. It was quite tense.
But eventually those tariffs were lifted, and that paved the way for the New Deal, the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement.
That's right. The tariffs came off about a year later, I think it was May 2019, explicitly as progress was being made on finalizing the USMCA.
So the tactic worked, in a way.
From Trump's perspective, yes.
Yeah.
The threat and the actual imposition of tariffs clearly pushed the negotiations forward and resulted in a deal that included some key U.S. demands.
Like changes to dairy access in Canada?
Yeah, increased access for U.S. dairy was a big one. Also, new rules for auto manufacturing requiring more North American content, and that controversial sunset clause, which means the deal has to be reviewed every 6 years, basically keeping the threat of renegotiation alive.
Okay, so USMCA gets ratified by everyone, comes into force July 2020. It seems like, okay, maybe that chapter of trade tension was closed.
For a while, perhaps. But the underlying dynamic using tariffs as a weapon was established, and that brings us to the current, much bigger threat, what our sources are calling the nuclear option potentially coming in 2025.
Right. This is the new announcement from Trump. What is he threatening now?
This is where it gets really alarming for Canada and Mexico. On November 25th, just recently, Trump stated very clearly that if he's reelected, one of his first acts, maybe day one, via executive order, would be imposing a 25% tariff on AL goods imported from Canada and Mexico.
Wait, not just steel and aluminum, everything.
Everything, across the board, 25%. It's exponentially bigger, more damaging than the 2018 targeted tariffs.
Okay, why? What's the justification this time? It can't be the same NAFTA renegotiation logic.
No, the stated justification now completely merges trade with border security. He's claiming this massive tariff is necessary because, in his words, of open borders.
Okay.
He's linking it directly to the flow of illegal immigrants, drugs, and specifically mentioning fentanyl coming to the U.S. He's basically saying because you're not controlling your borders effectively, we're hitting you with this giant economic penalty.
He's weaponizing the border issue to justify a trade war.
That's exactly how it appears. It connects two of his core political themes into one very aggressive policy proposal aimed squarely at America's neighbors.
Let's really pause here and talk about the scale of this. You used the phrase destroying blow earlier. Why would a 25% blanket tariff be that catastrophic, especially for Canada?
The sheer dependence is the key. Around 75% of everything Canada exports goes to the United States. 3/4 of their entire export economy relies on that single market.
Wow, 75%.
Yeah. So imagine suddenly adding a 25% tax onto 3/4 of your country's international sales. Overnight, Canadian goods become 25% more expensive compared to U.S. domestic products or imports from elsewhere.
So businesses just can't compete.
Many couldn't. It would mean instant unprofitability for vast sectors. We're talking widespread business failures, plant closures, massive unemployment. It would almost certainly trigger a deep recession in Canada and likely damage the U.S. economy significantly too through disrupted supply chains and higher prices.
Let's get specific beyond just steel and aluminum this time. Which sectors would be hit hardest by an everything tariff?
Well, number one, without a doubt, is the auto industry. The North American auto sector is maybe the most integrated cross-border industry in the world.
Parts crossing back and forth constantly.
Constantly. Components might cross the border multiple times before a car is finished. It's all built on just-in-time delivery and zero tariffs. A 25% tariff at each crossing. It blows up the entire model.
So factories close.
You'd almost certainly see massive disruption, likely plant closures, especially impacting manufacturing hubs like Ontario, but also hitting U.S. auto states. Job losses could easily run into the hundreds of thousands across the continent.
Okay, what else? Energy must be huge, too.
Absolutely critical. As Trudeau himself pointed out later, the U.S. gets about 65% of its imported oil from Canada. Not to mention vast amounts of natural gas and electricity that literally keep the lights on in parts of the U.S.
So tariffs on Canadian energy, that hurts American consumers too, right? Higher gas prices, higher electricity bills.
It would, definitely. But it would absolutely crush the profitability of Canadian energy producers, particularly in Alberta. It could potentially trigger a collapse in investment stock values, basically undermining the cornerstone of Canada's resource economy.
So when you say destroying blow, it's not an exaggeration.
No. Without exaggeration, this threat represents probably the single biggest, most immediate economic danger Canada has faced in generations.
Okay, so faced with this genuinely existential threat, a 25% tax on practically everything they sell to their biggest customer, Canada and Mexico had to react. And they chose completely different paths, didn't they?
Diametrically opposed strategies, really. It's quite striking.
Let's start with Mexico. How did they respond immediately after Trump made this threat?
Mexico chose defiance. Almost immediately, like hours after Trump's announcement on November 26th, the new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, came out swinging.
What did she say?
She stated very clearly and publicly that if Trump went ahead with these tariffs, Mexico would respond in kind. They would impose reciprocal tariffs on U.S. goods, a direct counter-threat.
That's a bold move. What was her reasoning? How did she justify that stance?
Well, she pushed back on Trump's justifications directly. On the drug issue, she basically said, look, the fentanyl crisis is driven by demand within the U.S. That's a U.S. domestic consumption problem, not solely Mexico's fault.
Shifting the blame, or at least sharing it.
Right. And on migration, she argued that Mexico has already spent enormous resources trying to manage migration flows towards the U.S., essentially saying, we're already doing our part, don't blame us. So the strategy was counter threats, refuse to be scapegoated, and signal strength.
Okay, so that's Mexico. Defiance, pushback, reciprocal threats. Now contrast that with Canada's approach, which, well, sources are calling it an appeasement strategy. That sounds painful.
It does, and the optics were certainly difficult. The contrast was stark. Just 4 days after Trump's threat on November 29th, what does Trudeau do? He flies down to Florida.
In Mar-a-Lago, Trump's resort.
To Mar-a-Lago. For a high-stakes meeting, and sources are clear. The entire point of this trip was for Trudeau to try and personally convince Donald Trump to drop the tariff threat, or at least soften it.
So instead of a public counter-threat, a private appeal, was that strategy just naive, trying to personally persuade Trump on something like this?
Well, looking back, the risks were huge, and the outcome, at least publicly, seemed to be immediate humiliation. This meeting is where that now infamous anecdote comes from.
The dinner.
The dinner, where Trump reportedly just relentlessly mocked Trudeau and his delegation, which included Dominic LeBlanc, who's now the finance minister.
This is the 51st state stuff.
Exactly. Sources say Trump kept joking repeatedly about Canada basically being absorbed into the U.S. as the 51st state.
Wow. That's deeply insulting.
It's about as insulting as you can get in that context. A direct jab at Canadian sovereignty and independence. And the truly telling part, according to these sources, is how the Canadians reacted.
How did they react?
They were apparently annoyed, deeply uncomfortable, internally humiliated.
Yeah.
But they felt they had to just sit there and laugh along.
They laughed at the joke about becoming the 51st state.
They forced themselves to laugh, to treat this political silly joke, as the source called it, as if it were actually funny. Because the priority was keeping the diplomatic channel open, trying to salvage the trade relationship, even if it meant swallowing national pride.
That's a rough image. And Trump didn't let it stay private, did he? He rubbed it in publicly later.
He absolutely did. A few days later, December 10th, he goes on his social media platform, Truth Social, and reinforces the mockery. He posts something referring to Trudeau as the governor of the great state of Canada.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So that just cemented it for many observers in Canada. The trip wasn't just a failure. The humiliation seemed intentional, a way for Trump to project dominance and maybe weaken Trudeau's standing back home.
So, after that Mar-a-Lago meeting and the public taunt, Trudeau had to try and recover somehow. He gave a speech later, I think, in Halifax, trying to make the case for Canada's importance to the U.S. economy.
Yes, he pivoted to a more traditional economic argument. And it's a valid one. He pointed out, correctly, that these kinds of massive tariffs would actually hurt Americans significantly.
By raising prices.
By raising prices on everything, disrupting supply chains. He highlighted the U.S. dependence on Canada, that massive 65% figure for imported oil, plus huge amounts of electricity, natural gas, steel, aluminum. Our economies are deeply intertwined.
So the message was kind of, this is mutually assured destruction, economically speaking. Don't do it.
That was the logical core of the argument, implying that it would be irrational for the U.S. to inflict that kind of self-harm.
He followed that defense with a pretty blunt admission, didn't he, about the potential impact on Canada itself?
He did. It was a moment of stark honesty, really. After making the case for interdependence, he still conceded that, despite the pain it would cause the U.S., a 25% tariff on all Canadian exports would still be absolutely devastating to the Canadian economy.
Wow.
That admission just underlined Canada's vulnerability. No matter how much leverage they thought they had due to interdependence, at the end of the day, they were profoundly exposed to this one potential decision in Washington.
So all this intense external pressure, the economic threat, the public humiliation, it wasn't happening in a vacuum, was it? The Trudeau government was already facing serious problems at home.
Oh, absolutely. The domestic political situation was already dire for them. Trudeau's Liberal Party had seen its support just plummet. You had the cost of living crisis really biting, high inflation, housing affordability issues, just a general sense of voter fatigue after nearly a decade in power.
What were the approval ratings like around that time?
By June, polling showed the Liberal Party down around 28% support nationally. That's really bad territory for a governing party in Canada. The foundation was incredibly shaky.
And the external pressure from Trump, the tariff threat, the mockery, that was like adding immense weight onto that already shaky foundation.
Precisely. It was amplifying the existing domestic weaknesses, making the government look ineffective, maybe even powerless on the international stage.
Which brings us to the biggest internal shockwave. Chrystia Freeland's departure on December 16th. She had been finance minister since 2020, but the sources are pretty clear this wasn't really her choice, was it?
No, the reporting indicates Trudeau essentially fired her. He informed her he no longer wanted her in that role, which forced her resignation.
And losing Freeland, that was a massive blow, wasn't it? Why was she considered so important?
She was more than just a finance minister. You have to remember, she was the person who led Canada's negotiating team during those really tough USMCA talks back in 2017-2018.
Right, she dealt directly with Trump's team then.
Directly with Robert Lighthizer, Trump's trade representative. She had credibility, deep international connections from her time as a journalist, real political skill. She was seen by many as the anchor of economic stability and competence in that government.
So removing her, especially right when this massive trade threat from Trump reappears, it seems incredibly risky, like sacking your best general right before the biggest battle.
That's a very good analogy. It stunned a lot of observers in Ottawa.
Okay, so why did it happen? The sources point to growing policy friction between Trudeau and Freeland, specifically over government spending and the deficit. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it seems to boil down to a fundamental disagreement over fiscal direction. Freeland, as a finance minister, was reportedly trying hard to rein in spending, get the budget deficit under control after all the pandemic emergency measures. She wanted fiscal discipline, especially with inflation running high. I think her target for the deficit was around $40 billion.
Okay, fiscal prudence. But Trudeau, facing those terrible poll numbers, he wanted policies that might win back voters, right? More populist measures.
Yes, exactly. Trudeau was pushing for more spending, things designed for immediate public appeal. The sources mentioned proposals like sending out $250 checks to lower and middle-income Canadians.
Oh, okay.
And bringing in temporary tax exemptions on essential goods, maybe around the holidays, to help with the cost of living.
And Freeland opposed these.
She reportedly saw them as fiscally irresponsible, especially given the inflationary pressures. She argued they were pouring fuel on the fire and making the deficit worse. And indeed, the deficit ended up ballooning to around $60 billion.
So $20 billion over her target.
Roughly, yeah. And that overrun was largely attributed to the kind of populist spending initiatives she had apparently argued against.
So she felt the government was sacrificing long-term fiscal health for short-term political survival, just as this huge economic threat was looming.
That seems to be the core of it. According to insider accounts, the final straw, the breaking point, was directly related to the Trump tariff threat. Freeland, having gone through the USMCA ordeal, apparently believed Canada was woefully unprepared for a 25% blanket tariff. She felt the government should be tightening its belt, building up fiscal defenses, showing resolve. Instead, they were spending money they didn't have on vote-buying measures.
So she wanted austerity and preparation. Trudeau wanted stimulus and populism.
That appears to be the fundamental clash. And when Trudeau wouldn't budge from his spending plans, the partnership fractured, and he decided to remove her.
And of course, Trump, who reportedly clashed with Freeland during the previous negotiations, he couldn't resist weighing in after she was gone, could he?
No, he definitely didn't miss the opportunity. His reaction was immediate and pointed. He put out a statement mocking both of them.
What did he say about Freeland specifically?
He called her behavior during the previous talks toxic and claimed she was unsuitable for striking deals.
Wow, toxic.
Yeah. And then he added the final twist of the knife, saying publicly that she won't be missed.
Ouch. So from Trump's perspective, this was a win, seeing a tough negotiator removed.
Absolutely. It looked like a major geopolitical victory for him. His pressure, his rhetoric, seemed to be directly contributing to instability and personnel changes within the Canadian government, removing someone he saw as an obstacle. It really reinforced the idea that external pressure was shaping Canada's internal politics.
Okay, so Freeland is out. The government is clearly shaken. The tariff threat is hanging over everything. What was the immediate next move? It sounds like they went straight into damage control mode.
Total damage control. And the focus shifted immediately to trying to appease Trump's stated reason for the tariffs, the border.
Right. First, the replacement. Who took over from Freeland as finance minister?
Dominic LeBlanc. He's known as a close Trudeau loyalist, very trusted within the prime minister's inner circle. He was actually part of that delegation that went to Mar-a-Lago and got mocked.
Ah, okay. So choosing him signals continuity with Trudeau's current direction, maybe loyalty over Freeland's independent stance.
That's certainly how many interpreted it. A signal that the prime minister was consolidating control and sticking to his strategy, whatever that was.
And LeBlanc's very first big announcement, literally the day after he sworn in, December 17th. It was all about the border, wasn't it?
It was a huge spending announcement. See, $1.25 billion. That's about US $909 million dedicated entirely to a new border security plan for the Canada-US border.
Wow, see $1.25 billion? That's a lot of money. And the timing. it seems like a direct response to Trump's tariff justification.
It's hard to see it any other way. This massive chunk of money is specifically aimed at doing the very thing Trump accused Canada of failing to do, tightening security along the northern border to reduce the flow of irregular migrants into the U.S.
So Canada is basically offering to spend its own money to address Trump's political concern, hoping that negates his reason for the tariffs.
That appears to be the calculation. It's a defensive strategy. Give Trump something concrete he can point to, a reason to back down from the tariffs without looking like he just folded. Call it the border gambit.
Okay, let's get into the details. What is that $1.25 billion actually supposed to pay for? What's in this new security plan?
It seems pretty comprehensive, focused on visibility and enforcement. Sources mention things like significant investment in new surveillance tech drones, thermal imaging, that kind of thing, especially for remote areas of the border.
More boots on the ground, too.
Yeah, increased deployment of RCMP officers, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to known crossing points. And also upgrades to infrastructure at official border crossings to process asylum seekers faster and, presumably, return those deemed ineligible more quickly.
So technology, personnel, infrastructure, it sounds like a serious effort.
It's certainly framed as one. The dollar figure alone sends a message. It's designed to look like Canada's taking the border issue extremely seriously.
But let's put this in perspective again. The number of people crossing illegally from Canada into the U.S. is tiny compared to the southern border, isn't it?
It's almost negligible in comparison. We're talking about U.S. authorities arresting maybe just over 23,000 people near the Canadian border in the entire year ending October 2024.
Okay, 23,000. And the southern border in that same period?
Nearly 1.5 million arrests.
Wow. So the Canadian border crossings account for less than 2% of the total.
Something like that, yeah. A very small fraction. Which really reinforces the idea that this $1.25 billion isn't primarily about solving an actual large-scale U.S. security crisis emanating from Canada.
It's political theater. Or maybe political payment.
You could call it that. It's about providing Donald Trump with a political off-ramp. It gives him something tangible to claim victory on. See, I made Canada pay to secure their border, which might allow him to quietly drop the devastating tariff threat without losing face with his base.
But even if this border gambit works externally, does it do anything to help Trudeau with his problems inside Canada? His political standing seems to be collapsing.
That's the huge risk here. This appeasement strategy might be aimed at Washington, but the political rot is happening at home in Ottawa. Trudeau's leadership is looking incredibly shaky.
We're hearing reports of Liberal MPs calling for him to resign.
Yes. At least 5 members of Parliament from his own Liberal Party have publicly said he should step down. That kind of open dissent is usually a sign of deep trouble for a leader.
And the math in Parliament itself. This government is a minority, right? How does that work?
It's precarious. Since the last election, Trudeau's Liberals haven't had a majority of seats, so they've relied on a deal with another party, the left-leaning New Democratic Party, NDP, to stay in power.
A confidence and supply agreement.
Exactly. The NDP agreed to vote with the Liberals on crucial things like the budget and confidence motions in exchange for the Liberals advancing some NDP policy priorities.
But that deal is over now, isn't it?
It is. The NDP withdrew their support back in September, citing dissatisfaction with the Liberals' progress on things like pharmacare.
Okay, so without the NDP's guaranteed support, what happens when Parliament comes back in January after the break?
That's the moment of truth. The opposition parties, likely led by the Conservatives, could force a vote of no confidence in the government.
And without the NDP deal, Trudeau likely loses that vote.
It's highly probable, almost certain, that he would lose. If the government loses a confidence vote, it automatically falls.
Which means an early election.
Exactly. A snap election would be triggered. And based on current polling, which shows the Conservative Party way ahead,
it looks like Trudeau would lose that election.
It looks very likely there would be a change in government. So, while Trudeau's official term isn't scheduled to end until October 2025, the chances of his government collapsing much sooner, perhaps as early as January or February, seem extremely high right now. The combination of the foreign pressure, the internal party division, and the parliamentary weakness is just. It's becoming overwhelming. #tag outro.
So let's synthesize this. Our deep dive into the source material paints a really stark picture. We see a Canadian government under, frankly, immense pressure from multiple angles. It's weakened internally by fights over spending, deficits, and its own sagging popularity. And at the same time, it's being actively undermined, even humiliated, by an external power, namely the potential next U.S. administration. And this core threat, the 25% blanket tariff, it feels designed not just to inflict economic pain, but maybe to force huge policy changes on trade, on borders, maybe even, intentionally or not, to push a political leader out of power.
It really forces you to consider the motives, doesn't it? The sources lay out this fascinating political dynamic. We've seen these really aggressive actions against Canada being justified using arguments about U.S. strategic interests, border security, fair trade.
Right, the policy justifications.
But then you also have the undeniable personal element, the repeated, very public mocking of Trudeau, the targeting of Freeland, that suggests a strong component of personal vendetta, of settling old scores.
So that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. When you weigh all this evidence, especially the sheer scale of the proposed 25% tariff, which seems vastly disproportionate if the only goal is addressing the relatively small northern border issue, what do you think is the primary driver here?
Is it really about a calculated strategic view of U.S. economic and security interests? Or is the main engine behind this incredibly aggressive stance towards Canada fueled more by personal animosity, by Trump wanting to settle that two-phase score and other perceived slights from Justin Trudeau?
And thinking longer term, what do you see as the biggest risk for Canada stemming from all this? Is it the immediate, potentially catastrophic economic damage from the tariffs themselves?
Or is it perhaps the dangerous precedent being set? The idea that Canada's domestic policy, its spending choices, its border security posture, maybe even its leadership, can be so effectively dictated by pressure and threats from its much larger neighbor. Where does that leave Canadian sovereignty down the road?
That is definitely the question to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.